Hi. Today we tackle modern human variation, what we more commonly refer to as race. And in the class discussion, I asked you if race exists. And if you say yes, then what is it? And if you say no, then if it doesn't exist, why do so many people live the consequences of race every day? And before we have this discussion, the first thing that we have to admit is that race is tough, right? Let's be brutally honest with one another. Race is tough. It's an awkward conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation. We go into it afraid that we're going to say something that gets us labeled a racist. People don't like to talk about race because it's such a tough nugget to deal with that we kind of just like to push it to the side and say, we'll worry about that one later. The other thing that we have to admit, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, every one of us has racial prejudice of some sort. At some point in our lives, every one of us has had a racist thought, or we've had a racist idea. We have judged somebody because of their race, and we've judged them negatively or harshly, or we've treated them differently because of that. Doesn't mean that we are a racist. It just means that at points in our life, we have given into those tendencies. And that's another reason why it makes it a hard conversation, is because to a certain extent we all feel a little bit of guilt, because we know that if we really pull the layers of the onion back, that even though everybody these days claims, oh, I'm not a racist, look at all the black friends that I have, look at all the white friends I have, look at all the Hispanic friends I have, that when we really take a good hard look at ourselves, it's the reality might not be quite as simple as that. So those honest assessments in mind, let's press on and actually talk about this idea of race. First and foremost, and really all I'm going to kind of focus on today is whether or not race exists. And here's the thing. Yes, race absolutely exists. But no, it doesn't. The problem with race is that there is absolutely a biological reality to the idea that people are different based on the part of the world that they come from. There is a genetic signature of people from different parts of the world. As I've said before, it's one of the reasons why forensic scientists can do forensic science, is because of the unique genetic fingerprints that we all carry. And among those genetic fingerprints are fingerprints that tell them what part of the world we came from or our ancestors came from. The problem is that we have taken this genetic reality, this biological reality, and we've attached social significance to it. And what that means is that now, when we say race, we mean something vastly different than what a scientist means when they used to say race. So I'm going to get to the no part in a minute, but just let me touch for a little bit on the reality of what race is. Like I said, the human species, as your book points out, we are a polytypic species. We are one single species. There are no genetic barriers between matings between a human from one part of the world and a human from the other part of the world. Somebody from Norway can mate with somebody from Swaziland and there's no problem. Somebody from the South Pacific Island can mate with somebody from above the Arctic Circle. There's no problem. So there is, so the human species is a single species, but we're what's called a polytypic species. And what that means is that as you look around the world, there are groups of people that are different from one another. Not all that hard to see. You look in Africa, people in Africa tend to have dark skin. You look in Europe, people in Europe tend to have lighter skin. You look in Asia, people in Asia tend to have uniquely shaped eyes. So there are characteristics, there are physical traits that we associate with different parts of the world. And those traits are indicators of a person's ancestry. And really, that's all that we can tell about a person. When a forensic anthropologist, I did forensic anthropology for about 10 years. when I would do a little forensics report for a medical examiner or police department, or if I was just working on an archaeological site with human remains in it, one of the one of the blanks that we'd fill out on the form, race, we'd put something in there, European, African, Native American, whatever it may be. What you're seeing, though, is that more and more in the past 15 or 20 years, scientists have recognized the problem with using the term race. Because we realize that, as I said, we mean something very specific, but socially and culturally, we've applied a different meaning to that word. So what has happened is what the genetic reality of what race is what we now refer to as ancestry. I can absolutely look at a person's bone, and I can tell you what part of the world they're from. I can tell you if their ancestors are of Asian descent, or European descent, or African descent. In some cases, we can even tell you to specific regions within Asia or Europe or Africa. And that's what race is. That's the genetic reality. It is ancestry. Nothing more, nothing less. The dilemma is that we have made much more of it. Because what we have done is we have taken this biological reality, and I should say this biological reality does matter. Some of you in your comments in the discussion say, yeah, race exists, but it doesn't really matter anymore. It absolutely does matter. For reasons that are not just the social consequences of race, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for practical purposes. We're learning more and more as we've unraveled the human genome and we look at the different genetic fingerprints from one region to the next. People from different parts of the world who have the same disease won't respond the same way to treatment. So a woman from Africa who has breast cancer and a woman from Asia who has breast cancer, they may need a very different treatment regimen than a woman from Europe who has breast cancer. So there are some important implications. There are reasons why the genetic reality of ancestry matters. But then we have this social construct of race. And as I said, many of you in your discussion posts key onto this social construct. And basically what we've done is we have decided that there's only really one trait that matters. And that trait is skin color. And depending on your skin color, we know a whole lot more about you. We know your morals, we know your values, we know your abilities, we know how hard you're likely to work, we know how smart you're likely to be, all of these things simply based on your skin color. And that's what we've attributed race to now. But there are a whole host of problems with that. There's a great video series that came out about 15 or 20 years ago by PBS called Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's a 3-part series. We used to watch it in this class. But one of the points that one of the biological anthropologists in the series makes is that when you think you see race, what you're actually seeing to a large degree is economics. And what she meant by that was, in the United States, prior to the Second World War, the racial divide was not what it is today. There was no black and white, because prior to the Civil Rights era, legally blacks were an underclass. They were second-class citizens, particularly throughout the South. In the United States, prior to the Second World War, the racial divide was which groups were white enough to be considered Caucasian. Because if you were classified as a Caucasian in the United States through the middle part of the 20th century, that mattered because it gave you access. It gave you access to property ownership and voting rights and a whole host of other things. So the Supreme Court in the 1920s had all these cases where they had to decide if a particular group of people were white enough to be Caucasian. There was a famous case. The man's name was Tozawa. I can't remember his first name, but he was from Japan, and he owned a fruit market in California. and he wanted to be classified as white. He wanted Japanese to be classified as Caucasian, because again, that way they could own their property, they could vote, they could have citizenship, they could have full rights of citizenship in the United States. The Supreme Court decided not that they were not, in fact, Caucasian, in a really convoluted decision that had actually contradicted a decision they had made about 5 years earlier in a separate case. And they, one of the consequences was that because Japanese citizens in the United States were not considered to be Caucasians, they were not fully citizens. During the Second World War, it was very easy for the government to justify putting these people in internment camps. Basically, we had prisoner of war camps for U.S. citizens, civilians, who had done nothing wrong, but simply because they were Japanese and they were now the enemy, they were put into camps. German Americans were not put into camps, even though there were far more German Americans than there were Japanese Americans. And Germany was just as big of a threat, probably in a lot of ways a greater threat to the United States in the Second World War than Japan was. But so that brings us up to the Second World War. After the Second World War, because of the war itself and the politics of the war, the racial divide becomes what we know it today, basically between blacks and whites, and increasingly now Hispanics. But there's something that's really important in this. We classify people into races based on their traits, but how much or how many traits are required to make a race? Prior to the 1960s and the Civil Rights era, in the South particularly, there were all sorts of laws that limited access for blacks. But the laws defined what blackness meant quite differently. So hypothetically, I'll get the numbers wrong, but it'll still illustrate the point. Georgia might have said, if you have 1/8 African ancestry, you're black. In Alabama, they might have said if you had 1/16 African ancestry. And Mississippi said if you had any African ancestry at all, you were black. So literally by changing state lines, you could change your race. We know, so the challenge is if the only trait that matters is skin color, well, how do we define skin color? Show me on a map where black skin ends and and brown skin begins. Where does brown skin end and light skin, beige skin, I guess, begin? Where does beige skin end and white skin begins? If you're looking solely at skin color, you have people living in Egypt and Libya and Northern Africa who actually have lighter skin color than people living in Southern Europe, but because they're Africans, they're classified as blacks, and because they're people living in Spain and Italy and Greece or Europeans, are classified as whites. So part of the challenge for our racial ideas is that it's not entirely clear what we mean when we're talking about a race, how we classify people into a race. Your book points out that these traits are distributed in what's known as a clinal fashion. That is, that they gradually change as you move through physical space. But there's no line in the sand where one of those traits ends and the next one begins. As I said, you can't start at the equator. If we're looking at skin color, which changes as you move north and south away from the equator, if you start at the equator and you move to the north, the skin colors gradually get lighter. You can't get to a point in the middle of Africa somewhere and say, okay, all the black people are behind us and the only people in front of us now are brown people. And then you walk a little bit farther and say, okay, all the brown people are behind us now, the people in front of us are tan. You walk a little bit farther, okay, the tan people are behind us, the people in front of us are white. This clinal distribution means that there's a very gradual change from one trait to the next. The other problem is that clinal distribution is not consistent. So I say, all right, skin color isn't good enough, because there's no clear delineation between where one skin color ends and one skin color and the next one begins. So I'm going to say, all right, I'll use skin color and blood type. Well, if we use the ABO blood system, and again, this is an example your book has, while skin color is distributed north to south, so like I said, you move away from the equator to the north, skin colors gradually get lighter, the ABO blood system is distributed east to west. So if you start at the same point in Africa and you move to the north, basically everybody's going to have the same blood type. But if you move to the east or you move to the west, blood types are going to change. So people who are put in the same race based on their skin color are likely to be put in a separate race based on their blood type. Consider this other example. Let's take 3 groups from Europe and 3 groups from Africa. Northern, Central, and Southern Europeans, Northern, Central, and Southern Africans. And only use one trait. And we'll start off with our traditional use of skin color. If we are going to use skin color to define race, then obviously people in Northern, Southern, and Central Europe will cluster together in one race, and people in Northern, Central, and Southern Africa will cluster together in a separate race. But again, there's no greater reason to use that trait than any of the other 30,000 or so traits that we have. So let's now consider anti-malarial genes. When we do that, what we find is that people who live in Northern Europe and people who live in Central Europe are going to cluster with South Africans because they don't have those anti-malarial genes. By comparison, people who live in Southern Europe will cluster with Northern and Central Africans because they do possess those genes. How about a third example? If you like to eat ice cream, how many of you like to eat ice cream? I bet a lot of you like to eat ice cream or cheese or drink milk. Your ability to do that is partly linked to your ability to break down a sugar that is found in a lot of dairy products called lactose, excuse me. And the enzyme in your body that does that is called lactase. And the gene that is associated with that enzyme is one that is associated with specific types of agricultural communities. So if we were going to use lactase, the ability to eat dairy products basically, as our gene, as our measure to classify people into races, what we would find is that most Europeans are going to cluster with a group called the Fulani in Central Africa because they possess those genes. By comparison, most other Africans would cluster with Asians and Native Americans because they lack those genes. So basically what that tells us is that for all intents and purposes, I can put you in whatever race I want to, depending on how I classify races. It's pretty darn arbitrary. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have really, really serious consequences. You don't have to look very far in the United States over the past year to see the consequences of race. And they go beyond the Fergusons and the Baltimores. Certainly, Dylann Roof went into a church in South Carolina because race mattered to him. But it goes beyond these stories that make the headlines. Race matters because I'm a white guy who I enjoy privileges in life simply because I'm a white guy. I was never given them. I was given them, but I never worked for them. I never earned them. It's just simply a benefit of being born a white male. By comparison, if you're an African American male or you're an African American female, you're Hispanic, you don't have the same privileges that I do. This naive notion that anybody can be the president of the United States, and however, Barack Obama, first African American president. It's true to a certain extent, but for me to have structured my life to become the president or to become a CEO or to become a college professor was a lot easier than somebody who is African American or somebody who's Hispanic. And I know everybody's going to say, well, yeah, but the NAACP and all these scholarships and all these quotas, and those don't even come close to leveling the playing field. Let me give you some examples. Our criminal justice system, horribly biased against African Americans. And again, this is outside of the Fergusons and the Baltimores and all of those incidents, simply day-to-day policing. There was a study done here in Connecticut not too long ago that showed the disproportionate number of police stops in Connecticut that target African American drivers. And that despite being a minority in the state, they made up a statistically significant proportion of overall traffic stops. And what's more is that once an African American driver is pulled over and a white driver is pulled over, even if they're pulled over for the same thing by the same police officer, the odds of the African American getting a ticket and a summons is actually far higher than the white person getting a ticket or a summons. If an African American and a white person are on trial for the same crime, with the same evidence against them, with the same judge, the black person is far more likely to be found guilty. If they're both found guilty, the black person is likely to have a far harsher sentence. And it goes beyond policing in our criminal justice system. Even today, if my African American friend and I were to go car shopping together, and we were trying to buy the same car, and we have the same jobs, we have the same income, and we have, our wealth is relatively the same. Everything about us is the same, and we're trying to buy the same car. Odds are my African American friend is going to end up spending about $700 more for that car than I will. I get a race bonus. It's not, written anywhere, but whites are offered more beneficial terms for cars. Same thing's true about, there's my son. The same thing's true about real estate. If my black friend and I are trying to buy a new house, I'm going to be shown the nice houses in the nice neighborhoods. Real estate agents will tend to shy away from or not show those same types of properties to African American buyers, even if they have the means to buy those houses. And it goes to employment as well. Many of you have probably heard this story, that this study's been done for probably 20 or 30 years, but for the last 10 or 15 years, what they do is they'll take two resumes. The resumes are identical to one another, and they will send them out to job search sites online. The only difference between the resumes is one of them has a stereotypically white-sounding name, one of them has a stereotypically black-sounding name. Other than that, they're identical. Yet, the white resume, the resume with the white-sounding name, the stereotypically white-sounding name, will get something like 50% more response than that of the black-sounding name. And that excuse me, that matters because that's opportunity. If I'm that white guy and I get 10 job offers, well, now I have a negotiating position. I really want a job in Connecticut. I can go, and they really want to hire me. I can say, well, yeah, but I have this job offer in New York, and they're offering me this, and that, so I have negotiating power. By comparison, my African American friend, he gets one job offer. Maybe he gets two. But he doesn't have nearly the options or the negotiating power that I do, and that has consequences. So to kind of sum this up, I apologize that this video is a little bit long, but it is such an important topic because this is the social issue that we will continue to deal with for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, the rest of your life probably. Hopefully we'll find some sort of way to figure it out. But race absolutely matters, but it is not what we think it is. When you're walking down the street and you see that African American male walking towards you, and in the back of your mind, as the white male, the back of my mind, he's probably in a gang, he probably deals drugs, he's probably got a gun, he's probably got a criminal record. All of those things may very well be true, but the assumption that I'm making is that they're true because he's black. And it's not true because he's black. It's true because of the position. It's largely true. There's some individual choice and individual decision making that also factors in, but largely it's true because of the position that we have put different communities in. Since the end of the Second World War, in the United States, whites were given greater access and greater opportunity. So that meant that whites were able to enjoy a greater quality of life in the United States than African Americans and now Hispanics as well. And even though the laws have changed, the Fair Housing Act and all the laws changed in the 1970s to remove that institutionalized legal discrimination that existed, the discrimination still goes on. And the impact of those decisions at the end of the Second World War are still rippling through modern society. It's not like just by making the behavior illegal, we have suddenly solved the problem, because the problem is so deep-rooted that is going to take a very long time to solve. So, I hope I've given you a fair amount to think about in regards to this issue. As I said, there is this biological reality that we now call ancestry, that reflects our genetic makeup, and where we are from as an individual and as a personal lineage. And then there's this social construct of race. And the social construct is in many ways arbitrary, and in many ways it's based on flawed ideas, but it carries tremendous consequences. If you have some thoughts, I please encourage you to share them, as always, in the discussion, or send me an email or something if you have any questions or thoughts about this video. Have a good day.